Thank you so much, Professor Rivkin, for the seminar. Does anyone want to make a question?
I would like to make a couple of questions. The first one has to do with the selection of or the checking particular principles in relation with the change in results in different schools with the same principles. If there are some kinds of data in the study about the same principle, the influence of the same principle into different schools, because I think that would be a good way of checking if there is a real influence in the different schools. And the other ones, I don't know if from the study it can be deduced any kind of characteristics for the principals. Which areas, for example, this should be good at, for example, if choosing the selection and controlling the teachers and the other staff, or the administration of the school, or perhaps the curriculum as far as they can choose, and things like that. So it can be deduced from the study what kind of characteristics and in which areas, main areas, a principal has to be good to improve the outcomes of the school.
Thank you. I think that that first question is very valuable, and it's something we're going to do in the future, because we can take our estimates of how well principals do in different schools and compare them. I think the one qualifier is that our most compelling estimates look at how well a principal did in a school versus someone else in the same school. And what strikes me as interesting is you may take a young person, they start off in a school, they end up doing very well, and better than the other principal who had been in that school previously. And that gives them a big advantage in the labor market, and they get hired by a very good school system that typically has very good principals. And maybe they just become the average principal in that new school. So, you know, it's sort of, it's kind of a good sports analogy, is that some football team has a young striker, some low-budget football team has a young striker. That person does much better than the person who was there before. And then all of a sudden they get bought by some rich team that always buys expensive strikers. And they end up being more or less average for that team, because they're pretty similar to the sort of expensive striker that they bought previously. I don't think we would want to conclude that because they weren't above average at that other team, that somehow we're not capturing, you know, the fact that this was a good player and that there's a big variation. And it sort of goes with this idea that when we're focusing on within school differences, you kind of lose all the between school variance. Nevertheless, I think if we're saying that bad principals are getting jobs in other schools, it's very important to look and see whether they're still being poor performers in the next school. And so we definitely need to start looking at the dynamics more and the comparisons more of how well the same person does in different schools. In fact, one of the things that we're going to do in a study we're doing on Chicago is to see when a principal goes from a low-poverty school to a high-poverty school, or reverse, do they seem to do equally well, better? And more than that, is the variation in performance among a group of principals when they're in the high-poverty school, is it larger than the variation of performance of the same group of principals when they're in the low-poverty school? So this is an area where we need to do a lot more work. I think the second question is a challenge for us. That I presented some information on the relationship between our estimate of principal quality and how well they seem to be doing at managing the stock of teachers, at making sure that the better teachers remain and the not so effective teachers leave. That's an indirect measure of how well they're doing, because we don't know if they actually denied contracts to someone, if they actually tried to do something special to keep someone to stay. We would love to have much more observational data on what principals we're actually doing, but we have none of that. So everything is sort of inferred from patterns that we observe in the data. And I think it's important there's been these disparate literatures where some people will go in schools and do a lot of description, and then there's this more recent literature of what we're doing, which is to do data-intensive work. And I think the key will be to link up those two by actually, and some people have done it. There's been a little work by Susanna Loeb and some colleagues to try to link up estimates of principal quality with observations of what they're doing in the school. But I don't think those observations are particularly strong. It's more based, I think, on self-surveys mostly, where really we need much stronger information about what makes a difference. Though I don't think from a policy point of view it's going to be to legislate those activities. I think it's almost more so to make sure that what we're capturing is actually variations in what the leaders are doing.
Well, I would like to make a question, because you're making, in one of your reasoning, you're making an assumption, that is that the effect of the principle is constant over the years. But I think that with the set of data that you have, it will be not too much difficult to estimate if this is true or not, in the sense that you can compare first year with second year, with third year, and then create a kind of line of influence of the principles. This is one question, because you said, okay, this good principle over 10 years, it will make an increase of, but I'm not sure that the effect of the principle is constant along the years. This is one question. And then the second question is about what you're measuring there, because you just said there is a kind of NAEP for this state, but what are you measuring? Reading?
So these are mathematics scores from the state mathematics exam.
Yeah. Then I will make a comment that maybe it's too strong to state that the quality of a principle is measured by just mathematics, because one thing is mathematics instruction, another thing is instruction in general, and a complete different thing is education. So to use the expression quality of education for just mathematics achievement, it's to go, from my point of view, is to go very far away.
Okay, thank you. Let me, I think, no, that's certainly a fair comment. And I think in the first case that we talked a little bit during the seminar about the fact that it's a very strict and almost certainly violated assumption that a principle is that you have a sort of stamp in your head of how good you are, and that's the way you always are. So there's a methodological implication to that, which probably means that we're underestimating the contributions of principles, the variation in principal quality. And it's certainly, you could think about, okay, let's think about putting a principal in a school. That principal in the first year is not going to be as good, and then they'll reach a sort of steady state after a couple of years. I think the point still holds if you're getting this variation in principal quality, that a 1 standard deviation increase in quality, whether it's permanent or transitory, still has a large effect on kids. I think in terms of thinking about the quality of education and measuring it on the basis of one potentially important mathematics, but also narrow measure, is certainly not saying that what we're capturing here is that this index of effectiveness based upon the effectiveness at raising mathematics achievement is the correct ordering of how effective a principal would be, even if we could sort of agree on all the things we like schools to do and how much each should be weighted. This is not that. But I think what this is really an example of is showing that the principal can have a large influence on an education outcome. And I think that the implication then that the principal can have large influences on lots of outcomes is one that I think comes from this. And so there's recent work done by Carabo Jackson and others which are focusing more on socio-emotional skills or behaviors. And he's arguing that some of this work, so Jonah Rockoff and Raj Chetty's work, is likely underestimating the effects of teachers on earnings, because earnings are influenced both by teacher value added to math and reading achievement, which is what they measure, but also teacher value added to social development. And in the States now, there's a growing belief that some of these behaviors are importantly related to labor market success, particularly for kids who don't go beyond secondary school in their educations. So I would completely agree that I don't mean to say we're getting an index of quality and this is all that should be measured. And this is a dangerous implication because in some places in the States they're kind of doing that on the basis of rewards. But I think what we're trying to say is what we're measuring is the impact of principles on an important outcome. And if we're finding that principles can have a large impact on this outcome, I think it's then reasonable to draw the inference that principles can really have a large impact on many outcomes that we really care about. And what the Chetty and Rockoff paper did was to go further and to say, here's a long-run outcome, which is earnings and labor market productivity that we know we care about, and we identify the fact that teachers seem to have a large impact on that outcome.
Maybe we can do the break, 5 or 10 minutes break. 5 minutes break, and we'll start with the second seminar.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.